The drop of sauce on the silver spoon was worth more than the boy's entire life. Or at least, that's what the guests in the room believed. Under the crystal chandeliers of New York's most exclusive restaurant, Chef Gordon Vance stood like a king, waiting for the applause that would cement his legacy. The air smelled of expensive wine and arrogance. It was a perfect night, a flawless lie. But then the service doors swung open. It wasn't security. It wasn't a late guest. It was a smell. Before anyone saw him, they smelled him. The sharp, unmistakable scent of burnt oak and old iron. A scent that didn't belong in a palace. And then came the boy. 11 years old, shoes held together with duct tape, dragging a backpack that looked heavy enough to crush his spine. He didn't look at the billionaires. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked straight at the terrified man in the white chef's coat. The room went deadly silent. Not out of respect, but out of confusion. Why was the great Gordon Vance, a man who could ruin careers with a snap of his fingers, suddenly clutching the table like he was about to fall? The boy stepped forward, pulled a rusted, blackened cast-iron skillet from his bag, and set it on the marble floor with a heavy thud that echoed like a judgment. "You forgot the hickory, Gordy," the boy whispered. And just like that, the million-dollar lie began to crack. Because in a room full of people pretending to be something they weren't, a homeless child was the only one who had brought the truth. And he was ready to serve it cold. The air inside the obsidian didn't smell like food. It smelled like money. It was a cold, metallic scent, compounded by the heavy perfumes of Manhattan's elite and the crisp starch of white linen tablecloths. In the center of the room, under a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of ice, Chef Gordon Vance held a silver ladle as if it were a scepter. He was a man who had curated every inch of his existence. His chef's whites were tailored in Italy, his silver hair was swept back with geometric precision, and his smile was practiced enough to hide the cruelty that lived in the corners of his mouth. Tonight was his coronation. The unveiling of the onyx glaze, a sauce he claimed had taken him a decade to perfect. A sauce that critics were already calling the culinary invention of the century. Vance lowered the ladle, allowing a single dark drop to fall onto the center of a pristine white ceramic plate. The room, filled with hedge fund managers, actresses, and the city's most feared food critics, held its breath. "Simplicity," Vance whispered, his voice amplified by a hidden microphone so it seemed to come from the walls themselves. "That is the ultimate sophistication. You see, cooking is not about adding. It is about taking away until only the truth remains. This sauce is my soul on a plate." A ripple of polite, reverent applause moved through the crowd. Waiters, moving like synchronized shadows, began to step forward to serve the tasting portions. It's a lie. The voice was small, rough, and cracked with the onset of puberty. It didn't belong here. It cut through the climate-controlled air like a serrated knife. The applause died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that usually precedes a disaster. Heads turned, diamonds catching the light, as necks craned toward the back of the room near the kitchen service doors. Standing there was a boy who looked like a bruise on the face of the evening. He couldn't have been more than 11 years old. He wore a gray hoodie that was stained with grease and dark patches of old rain. His sneakers were held together with silver duct tape, and on his back he carried a backpack that looked heavy enough to crush him. But it wasn't just his appearance that jarred the senses. It was the smell. As he stepped further into the light, a scent followed him. Not the expensive aroma of the restaurant, but the sharp, acrid smell of wood smoke and old, burned fat. Gordon Vance froze. For a second, his curated mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine irritation. He motioned with a flick of his wrist to the security guard standing in the shadows. "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen," Vance said, his voice regaining its smooth, oily texture. "It seems we have a stray. Security will handle it." The guard, a man the size of a vending machine, stepped forward, his hand reaching for the boy's shoulder. "It's a lie," the boy said again, louder this time. He didn't flinch as the guard loomed over him. He kept his eyes locked on Vance. "You said you invented it. You said it took you 10 years. But you didn't invent anything. You stole it." The guard's hand clamped down on the boy's shoulder, bunching the dirty fabric of the hoodie. "Let's go, kid. Don't make this ugly." "Wait." The single word came from the front table. It was spoken softly, but it carried more weight than Vance's amplified speech. Arthur Sterling, the most feared food critic in New York, lowered his wine glass. He was a man who could close a restaurant with a single adjective. He turned in his chair, his eyes narrowing behind thick-rimmed glasses as he studied the boy. "Let him speak," Sterling said. Vance's smile tightened until it looked painful. "Arthur, please. It's just a homeless child looking for a handout. It's distressing the guests." "I don't want your money," the boy spat, shaking off the guard's grip with a surprising twist of his body. He took 3 steps into the dining area, his dirty sneakers squeaking against the marble floor. He looked at the single drop of onyx glaze on the demo plate. "I just want you to admit it. It smells wrong." Vance laughed, a dry barking sound. "It smells wrong. Boy, this sauce contains ingredients you couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. What could you possibly know about high cuisine?" The boy reached up and pulled the straps of his backpack tighter, his knuckles white. "I don't know anything about high cuisine. But I know that sauce. I know it because I scrubbed the pot it was made in every night for 3 years. I know it because the smell of it is stuck in my clothes." He took a deep breath, his chest heaving. "It smells wrong because you forgot the hickory smoke," the boy said, his voice trembling now, not with fear, but with a deep, aching rage. "And you put the nutmeg in too early. I can smell the bitterness from here. Grandma Rose told you never to rush the nutmeg, Gordon. She told you that 15 years ago, before you stole her notebook and ran away." The name Rose hit Gordon Vance like a physical blow. The color drained from his face so fast, it left him looking gray under the harsh chandelier light. The silver ladle in his hand trembled just once, a tiny vibration that sounded like a bell against the china. The room went deadly silent, the kind of silence where careers are made or destroyed. Arthur Sterling looked from the terrified but defiant boy to the pale, shaking hands of the famous chef. He picked up his fork. "Rose," Sterling murmured, as if tasting the name. He looked at Vance. "Why does that name make you look like you've seen a ghost, Gordon?" The boy didn't wait for Vance to answer. He swung his heavy backpack off his shoulder and dropped it onto the floor with a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the room. "He looks like that because she died last week," the boy said, tears finally spilling over his grime-streaked cheeks, cutting clean paths through the dirt. "And he knows he owes her everything." Vance recovered quickly. It was a skill he had honed over years of dealing with temperamental investors and health inspectors. He smoothed the front of his pristine white jacket, forcing a sympathetic, albeit patronizing, expression onto his face. "A tragedy," Vance said, his voice dropping to a practiced register of concern. "Truly, boy. Rose was a character. I'm sorry for your loss. But grief makes us say wild things, doesn't it? It makes us imagine thieves where there are only old acquaintances." He gestured to the guard again, more sharply this time. Get him a hot meal in the kitchen, then call social services. He's clearly delirious. I'm not hungry, the boy said. He knelt on the marble floor and unzipped the battered backpack. The guests flinched. In a city like New York, an erratic stranger reaching into a bag usually meant one thing. A woman near the front gasped, clutching her pearls. Even the guard hesitated, his hand hovering over his taser. But the boy didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a skillet. It was cast iron, 10 inches wide, and black as midnight. It wasn't the smooth, factory-finished iron sold in boutique cooking stores. This pan was crusted with decades of carbon, uneven and ugly, its handle wrapped in layers of duct tape where the metal had grown too hot to hold. It landed on the polished floor with a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the souls of everyone standing nearby. This is all I have left, the boy said, his hand resting on the handle as if it were an anchor keeping him from drifting away. You took her notebook. You took the sauce. But you couldn't take this. It was too heavy for you to run with. Arthur Sterling stood up. The chair scraped loudly behind him. The critic walked past the frozen waitstaff, past the murmuring guests, until he stood looming over the boy. He looked down at the pan, then at the boy's face. What is your name, son? Sterling asked. Leo, the boy answered, not looking up. He was staring at Vance. And you claim, Sterling continued, turning his gaze toward the chef, that the great Gordon Vance, the man who just served us a scallop seared to perfection, was... What? A thief? He was a dishwasher, Leo said. The words hung in the air, stripping away the glamour of the room. His name isn't Gordon Vance, it's Gordy. He scrubbed pots for my grandma at Rose's Smokehouse in Queens. He didn't know how to boil an egg. Vance's face flushed a deep, ugly red. This is slander. I trained in Paris. You trained in Queens, Leo shouted, the anger finally breaking through his exhaustion. You watched her. You watched how she mixed the molasses and the vinegar. You watched how she burned the hickory just right. And the night she had her first stroke, when the ambulance came. You didn't call for help. You went to the safe. You took the cash, and you took the recipe book. The accusation was specific, brutal, and terrifyingly plausible. The room shifted. The guests were no longer looking at Vance with adoration. They were looking at him with the morbid curiosity of people witnessing a car crash. Vance laughed, but it was a brittle sound. You have a vivid imagination, Leo. A notebook? Please, I have 3 Michelin stars. What could I possibly learn from a roadside barbecue shack? Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, terrifying letter. The logo of the bank was visible, even from a distance. She died owing $20,000 because she couldn't pay the mortgage after the customers stopped coming. They stopped coming because you opened a chain of Vance's BBQ right down the street, selling her food at half the price using factory ingredients. Leo held the letter up. His hand was shaking. They're taking the smokehouse tomorrow, Gordy. Unless I pay them. But I don't have the money. I only have the truth. Vance sneered, his arrogance returning as he saw the boy's desperation. So this is a shakedown. You want money? Is that it? You want a payout to go away? No. Leo stood up, gripping the heavy iron skillet. I want you to prove you're real. If you invented that sauce, if you really are the genius they say you are, then cook it again. Right now, against me. A gasp rippled through the room. You want to cook against me? Vance looked around the room, inviting the audience to share in the joke. With what? That dirty piece of scrap metal? With this pan, Leo said. And the ingredients you have in your kitchen. 1 hour. If you win, I'll tell everyone I lied. I'll go to jail. I don't care. And if you win? Arthur Sterling asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Leo looked at the bank letter in his hand, then at the man who had stolen his grandmother's life. If I win, you pay the debt. You save her house. And you admit where you got the recipe. Vance looked at the crowd. He saw the doubt in their eyes. He realized he had no choice. If he backed down now, the rumor would haunt him forever. But if he crushed this street rat, if he humiliated him with superior technique and equipment, he would emerge not just as a chef, but as a god. Besides, it was impossible for him to lose. He had a kitchen worth $2 million. The boy had a rusted pan and a backpack full of grief. Fine, Vance spat, unbuttoning his cuffs. I accept. But when you fail, Leo, and you will fail, I want you removed from this building through the garbage chute. He turned to his sous chefs, clapping his hands sharply. Clear the station, and get a camera crew in here. If the boy wants a show, let's give him a finale. Leo didn't move. He just gripped the handle of the cast iron skillet tighter, feeling the cold metal warm against his palm. It felt like holding his grandmother's hand. He wasn't alone. Not really. The kitchen of the Obsidian was not designed for cooking. It was designed for surgery. Under the harsh, shadowless fluorescent lights, the stainless steel counters gleamed with a sterility that made Leo's skin crawl. It was a world of digital thermometers, immersion circulators, and liquid nitrogen tanks. There was no fire here, only induction heat and silent, humming machinery. Gordon Vance moved through this space like a shark in familiar waters. He didn't just cook, he commanded. At his station, surrounded by 3 anxious sous chefs, he began to dismantle a rack of prime lamb with the precision of an anatomist. He didn't look at the meat. He looked at the camera crew that had squeezed into the kitchen, flashing his winning smile as he dropped shallots into a copper pan worth more than Leo's entire life. Watch the heat. Vance lectured for the benefit of the audience watching on the monitors in the dining room. The sugars in the shallot must caramelize, not burn. It requires patience. It requires control. 10 feet away, Leo stood on a plastic crate just to reach the countertop. He looked ridiculous. The oversized chef's apron someone had thrown at him hung down to his ankles, and his hands, still grimed with the city's dust, looked small and fragile against the expanse of steel. He had no sous chefs. He had no copper pans. He had only the black iron skillet sitting on the induction burner, looking like a relic from another century. Leo closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the hum of the refrigerators and the murmur of the crowd. He tried to summon the smell of the smokehouse, the rich, heavy scent of oak and molasses. But all he could smell was sanitizer and truffle oil. Fear, cold and sharp, began to rise in his throat. I can't do this, he thought. I'm just a kid. I don't belong here. His hand trembled as he reached for the jar of dry rub he had pulled from his backpack. It was a mason jar, the lid dented, filled with a reddish-brown powder that looked like dirt compared to the vibrant spices in Vance's rack. Need a map, kid? The jeer came from one of Vance's line cooks, a tall man with a sneer, chopping parsley with machine gun speed. Don't get lost in the pantry. We don't have a section for garbage. Laughter rippled through the kitchen brigade. Leo flinched. The jar slipped in his sweating palm, nearly crashing onto the floor. He caught it against his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Ignore them. The whisper came from his left. Leo looked up. Standing at the vegetable station was a young man with dark circles under his eyes and a burned scar running up his forearm. Marco. He wasn't laughing. He was watching the iron skillet with an expression Leo hadn't expected to see in this place. Respect. Marco slid a block of golden, high-fat butter across the steel counter. It stopped inches from Leo's hand. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at Leo, but the gesture was deafening. In a kitchen ruled by ego, sharing an ingredient was an act of rebellion. Leo looked at the butter, then at Marco's scarred arm. He realized then that Marco wasn't like Vance. Marco had burns. Marco knew what fire felt like. A sudden calm settled over Leo. He wasn't cooking for the critics anymore. He was cooking for Marco. He was cooking for Grandma Rose. He turned the burner to high. While Vance was using a pipette to measure vinegar, Leo grabbed a handful of the dry rub and slapped it onto the cheap cut of pork shoulder the kitchen had reluctantly provided. He didn't measure. Grandma never measured. "The meat tells you what it needs," she used to say. "Listen to it." He threw the butter into the skillet. It hit the hot iron with a violent hiss, foaming and spitting. The sound was aggressive, raw, and alive. It cut through the polite hum of Vance's machines. Vance looked over, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Turn that down," he snapped. "You're burning the butter solids. You're ruining the base." "I'm browning them," Leo said, his voice steady now. "It's called flavor, Gordy. You'd know that if you hadn't forgotten where you came from." He dropped the meat into the pan. The smoke rose instantly, thick, gray, and fragrant. It wasn't the polite steam of a water bath. It was the aggressive smoke of a sear. It carried the smell of paprika, cumin, brown sugar, and something else. The unique, metallic tang of the seasoned iron. In the dining room, noses began to twitch. The smell of Vance's reduction was elegant, floral, and subtle. But the smell coming from Leo's station was primal. It triggered something deep in the lizard brain of every person in the building. It smelled like hunger. Vance sensed the shift in the room's energy. His movements became jerkier. He began to whisk his sauce furiously, adding heavy cream, trying to drown out the boy's presence. "More truffle," he barked at his sous chef. "It needs more complexity. It's too flat." Leo didn't look up. He was in the rhythm now, the zone. The world narrowed down to the heat of the pan and the color of the crust forming on the meat. He reached for the vinegar, then stopped. The secret. He remembered the night Grandma Rose had taught him the final step of the onyx glaze. It was raining. The roof of the smokehouse was leaking into a bucket. She had held a small, wrinkled nutmeg nut in her hand. "Everyone thinks the secret is the sugar, Leo," she had whispered, coughing into her handkerchief. "But sugar just makes it sweet. The secret is the bitterness. You have to add the nutmeg right before the end, but you have to take it off the fire first. If you cook the nutmeg, it dies. If you let it bloom in the residual heat, it sings." Leo glanced at Vance. The great chef was grating nutmeg directly into his boiling saucepan. He was cooking it. He was killing it. He was following the stolen recipe, but he had never understood the why. He was playing the notes, but he couldn't hear the music. Leo waited. He flipped the meat, basting it with the dark, bubbling juices in the pan. He waited until the pork was firm to the touch, not the firmness of a tire, but the firmness of a flexed muscle. He killed the heat. Silence fell over his station. The hiss died down to a whisper. Only then, in the quiet warmth of the cooling iron, did Leo reach into his pocket and pull out a tiny paper packet. He sprinkled the pinch of fresh nutmeg over the meat and the sauce pooling at the bottom of the pan. He didn't stir it. He just let the heat of the iron do the work, releasing a warm, nutty aroma that curled up and wrapped around the harsh smell of the scorched butter. Time. Arthur Sterling's voice rang out from the doorway. Vance slammed his spoon down, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. His plate looked like a piece of modern art, geometric, glossy, perfect. Leo slid his skillet onto a wooden board. It looked like a mess. It looked like dinner. He looked across the pass at Vance. The chef was breathing hard, his eyes darting around the room, seeking validation. Leo just wiped his hands on his dirty apron. He knew something Vance didn't. He knew that the truth didn't need a garnish. The journey from the kitchen to the dining room felt like crossing a border between two warring nations. A waiter in white gloves carried Vance's plate as if it were a holy relic. The dish was a masterpiece of geometry. 3 perfect medallions of pork, resting on a smear of the dark, glossy sauce, garnished with microgreens placed with tweezers. It didn't look like food, it looked like architecture. Leo walked behind him, carrying the heavy iron skillet himself. He refused the waiter's help. The pan was still sizzling, spitting tiny droplets of grease that landed on the pristine marble floor, leaving a trail of imperfection in the temple of fine dining. When he set the skillet down on the starched white tablecloth in front of Arthur Sterling, the heat radiating from the iron made the crystal glasses fog up. The contrast was violent. The delicate porcelain of Vance's dish sitting next to the blackened, war-torn metal of Leo's pan. "Presentation," Vance said, smoothing his tie, "is part of the flavor. We eat with our eyes first, Arthur." Sterling didn't look up. He picked up his silver fork and knife. "I eat with my mouth, Gordon. Let's begin." He started with Vance's dish. The room watched in a silence so deep, you could hear the traffic on the street outside. Sterling sliced through the pork. The knife met no resistance. He lifted the fork, inspected the glaze catching the light, and placed it in his mouth. Vance leaned forward, holding his breath. Sterling chewed slowly. His face was a mask of professional detachment. He swallowed, took a sip of water, and dabbed his lips with a napkin. "It is flawless," Sterling said. His voice was cool, analytical. "The texture is like velvet. The balance of acid and sweet is mathematically perfect. It is a triumph of technique, Gordon." Vance exhaled, a smile spreading across his face like a crack in ice. "Thank you, Arthur. I knew you would understand the complexity." "However," Sterling continued, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine blade, "it is also cold." "Cold?" Vance frowned. "It was plated 30 seconds ago. It's perfectly Not temperature," Sterling cut him off. "Spirit. It tastes like a laboratory. It tastes like ego." Vance's smile faltered. Sterling turned to the iron skillet. There was no garnish, no microgreens. Just a hunk of pork shoulder, swimming in a dark, thick liquid that bubbled gently against the sides of the pan. It looked messy. It looked aggressive. Sterling didn't use the knife this time. He pressed the edge of his fork against the meat, and it fell apart. It surrendered. He scooped up a piece, dripping with the dark sauce, and raised it to his lips. He closed his eyes. The moment the sauce hit his tongue, Arthur Sterling was no longer sitting in a $1 million restaurant in Manhattan. New York, 1995, winter. The wind cut through his thin coat like a razor. He was 22, a failed journalism student with $3 in his pocket and a hole in his shoe. He was standing outside a shack in Queens, shivering, smelling the smoke that poured from the chimney. The door opened. A woman with hands the size of baseball mitts and a smile that could warm a city block stepped out. Rose. She didn't ask if he had money. She just saw the hunger in his eyes. "Come in, sugar," she had said, her voice like gravel. "And honey, you look like you need something that sticks to your ribs." She had handed him a plate. This plate. This taste. The sharp bite of apple cider vinegar cutting through the richness of the pork, the deep, earthy hum of cumin. And then, that finish. That warm, nutty whisper at the end that made you feel safe. In the present, a single tear escaped from Arthur Sterling's closed eye. It tracked through the powder on his cheek and vanished into his beard. The room gasped. Arthur Sterling, the man who had once compared a risotto to wet cardboard, was crying. He opened his eyes. They weren't cold anymore. They were red-rimmed and terrifyingly human. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, seeing the ghost of the woman who had saved him 30 years ago standing in the boy's dirty sneakers. "The hickory," Sterling whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You used damp hickory chips, didn't you? To slow the smoke." Leo nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Yes. Grandma said dry wood burns too fast. Damp wood tells a story." Sterling turned slowly to Gordon Vance. The critic's face hardened. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp fury. "You told me," Sterling said, his voice rising, "that you spent 10 years developing this flavor profile in your test kitchen in Zurich." Vance was sweating now. Visible beads of perspiration gathered on his upper lip. "I did. I refined it. I elevated it. The boy's version is crude, Arthur. It's peasant food. It's honest." Sterling slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "It tastes like love, Gordon. And your dish? Your dish tastes like theft." He pointed a shaking finger at the skillet. "I ate this exact sauce 30 years ago at a roadside stand in Queens. I never forgot it. I spent decades looking for a flavor that could match it. And tonight you serve me a photocopy and claim it's an original masterpiece." "This is absurd," Vance hissed, backing away as the guests began to murmur, phones raised, recording every second. "You're emotional. You're letting nostalgia cloud your palate. I am Gordon Vance. I have 3 stars. I don't steal from barbecue shacks." "Then explain the nutmeg," Leo said. The boy's voice was quiet, but it silenced the room instantly. Vance froze. "What?" "The nutmeg," Leo repeated, stepping forward. "Mr. Sterling, you tasted both. Tell him." Sterling looked at the boy, confused. Then he looked at the empty plate where Vance's pork had been. He ran his tongue over his teeth, searching for the aftertaste. "There is a bitterness," Sterling admitted slowly. "A tiny, metallic bitterness at the back of the throat. I thought it was the wine pairing." "It's not the wine," Leo said, his eyes locking onto Vance's terrified gaze. "It's the nutmeg. You put it in the reduction, didn't you, Gordy? You boiled it with the cream." "That's standard technique," Vance shouted, his composure shattering. "You have the flavor." "Not with nutmeg," Leo said, shaking his head with the weary wisdom of an old man. "Grandma Rose always said, heat kills the sweet. You have to add it cold, right at the end, off the fire. If you boil it, it turns bitter." Leo pointed to the cast iron skillet. "I added mine after I took it off the burner. That's why mine sings, and yours screams." He took a step closer to the famous chef. "You have the recipe, Gordy. You have the notes. But you never stayed in the kitchen long enough to watch her cook. You stole the paper, but you missed the lesson." Vance stared at the boy. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to spin another lie. But he couldn't. The bitterness was there, in his mouth, undeniable and damning. He had been undone not by a lawyer or a contract, but by a pinch of spice. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the room was the hum of the ventilation system. Gordon Vance stared at the boy, his face draining of color, then flooding with a violent, blotchy red. The humiliation wasn't just burning him, it was incinerating him. He looked at the phones raised in the hands of the guests, the recording red lights like 100 unblinking eyes. He looked at Arthur Sterling, whose gaze was now filled with the kind of pity usually reserved for a dying animal. Vance snapped. It wasn't a calculated move. It was the flailing reaction of a man watching his empire crumble. He lunged forward, his hand sweeping across the table in a vicious arc. The cast-iron skillet flew. It hit the marble floor with a sound that felt less like metal striking stone and more like a bone breaking. The heavy iron cracked near the handle. The sauce, the dark, rich liquid that carried the soul of Rose's smokehouse, splattered across the pristine white shoes of the front row guests. "It's poisoned!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking, high and hysterical. He pointed a trembling finger at Leo. "You saw him." He pulled a packet from his pocket. He spiked the food. "That's why it tastes different. It's not nutmeg, it's a contaminant." Leo didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at the shocked crowd. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over the broken pieces of the skillet. The iron was still hot, radiating warmth, but it was ruined. The hairline fracture ran right through the center, severing the metal that had cooked 1,000 family meals. "Grandma," Leo whispered, the word lost in the chaos erupting above him. "Security!" Vance bellowed, backing away as if Leo were radioactive. "Call the police. This is an attack. I want this street rat arrested for poisoning food in a Michelin star establishment. Get him out of here." The large guard moved in. He didn't handle Leo gently this time. He grabbed the back of Leo's hoodie and hauled him up, the boy's feet dangling inches off the floor. "No." Leo kicked out, panic finally setting in. "I didn't poison anything. Check the packet. It's just spice. Let me go." "You're done, kid," the guard grunted, dragging him toward the service. "Exit. You're going to juvie. Wait." Arthur Sterling stood up, blocking the guard's path. "Put him down. This is madness, Gordon. We all saw him eat it. I ate it. Then you're compromised." Vance shouted, spit flying from his mouth. He was pacing now, frantic, his eyes wild. "The boy is a plant, a corporate saboteur. I am the victim here. Get him out. Now." The guard shoved Sterling aside, a shocking breach of protocol that showed just how far the situation had deteriorated, and dragged Leo toward the swinging kitchen doors. Leo twisted his head back, his eyes locking onto the broken skillet left on the floor, abandoned like trash. They burst through the doors into the kitchen. The noise of the dining room was cut off, replaced by the sterile hum of the appliances. "Move it," the guard growled, pushing Leo toward the back loading dock. "Stop." The command was quiet, but it stopped the guard in his tracks. Marco stood in the center of the pass, blocking the way. He hadn't moved since the cooking challenge ended. He was still holding his tasting spoon, his eyes fixed on the monitor that showed the live feed of the dining room, the image of the broken skillet on the floor frozen on the screen. "Get out of the way, Marco," the guard warned. "Boss's orders." Marco looked at Leo. He saw the grease on the boy's face, the terror in his eyes, and the sheer, crushing weight of injustice pressing down on his small shoulders. Then he looked at the other cooks. The line was silent. The dishwasher had stopped spraying. The sous chefs were frozen. These were men and women who worked 14-hour days on their feet, who had burns on their arms and debt in their bank accounts. They weren't Gordon Vance. They were Leo. Marco slowly reached behind his back and untied the knot of his apron. "You're not taking him to the police," Marco said. "Excuse me?" The guard blinked, Marco pulled the white apron over his head. It fell to the floor, landing with a soft sigh. Underneath, he wore a faded t-shirt that said, "Queen Strong." I said, "You're not taking him," Marco repeated, stepping forward. "Because if you do, who's going to cook the rest of the service?" "I don't need you." Vance's voice came from behind the guard. The chef had stormed into the kitchen, looking for an escape route from the dining room. "You're a line cook, Marco. You're replaceable. I can hire 10 of you by tomorrow morning. Now move." Marco didn't move. He looked at the sous chef on the meat station. "Hey, Tony. You remember how Vance claimed your chimichurri recipe was his idea last month? The one your abuela taught you?" Tony, a burly man with tattoos up his neck, looked down at his knife. He looked at Vance. Then, without a word, he untied his apron. It joined Marco's on the floor. "Sarah?" Marco looked at the pastry chef. "Remember when he made you work through your sister's funeral because dedication is everything?" Sarah wiped her hands on a towel. She took off her toque, the tall white hat that symbolized rank, and placed it on the counter. "I quit. This is mutiny," Vance screamed, his voice reaching a pitch that was almost inhuman. "I will blacklist you. None of you will ever work in this city again. I will destroy you." "You're already destroyed, chef," Tony said, his voice deep and calm. He walked over to the guard, who looked suddenly unsure of his odds against a kitchen full of angry staff holding knives and cleavers. "Let the kid go." The guard looked at the wall of white jackets closing in. He released his grip on Leo's hoodie. Leo stumbled forward, catching himself against a prep table. Marco knelt down next to him. "You okay, kid?" Leo nodded, rubbing his neck. "My pen." He broke it. "Iron breaks," Marco said gently. "But the fire doesn't. You still have the fire." The kitchen doors swung open again. Arthur Sterling walked in, phone in hand. He was live streaming. "Say hello to the world, Gordon," Sterling said, panning the camera to show the pile of discarded aprons and the empty stations. "I just told my 2 million followers that the Obsidian has no staff, no integrity, and apparently, no original recipes." The reservation cancellations started coming in about 30 seconds ago. Vance slumped against the stainless steel counter, sliding down until he hit the floor. He looked small now. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind only a terrified man in an expensive suit who realized he had forgotten how to cook anything real. Leo walked over to Vance. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired. "You could have just asked her," Leo said softly. "Grandma Rose waited for you to come back. She used to say, 'Gordy probably just got lost.' She would have given you the recipe if you'd just asked." Vance put his head in his hands and began to weep. It wasn't a dignified sound. Leo turned to Marco and the other cooks. "I have to go. They're taking the smokehouse tomorrow. I have to pack." "No," Sterling said, lowering his phone. "You don't have to pack anything." He tapped his screen, showing a transfer confirmation. "I just paid the bank. The debt is cleared." Leo stared at him. "Why?" "Because," Sterling said, looking at the empty kitchen, "I haven't had a decent meal in 20 years. And I have a feeling I'm going to need a reservation at Rose's Smokehouse very soon." He looked at Marco and the other cooks. "And it looks like you're going to need a staff." Marco smiled, picking up his knife roll. "I've always liked BBQ." Leo looked around the room, at the strangers who had become an army, at the critic who had become a savior. And finally, he let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the day his grandmother died. "We open at noon," Leo said. "Don't be late." Queens did not wake up like Manhattan. Manhattan woke up with the jarring blare of horns and the hiss of hydraulics. Queens woke up with the slow, rhythmic rumble of the elevated train and the smell of wet pavement drying in the morning sun. It was 6 a.m. when Leo stood in front of Rose's smokehouse. The building looked tired. The red brick was chipped, the awning was faded to a dusty pink, and the closed sign in the window hung crookedly, held up by a piece of yellowed Scotch tape. It was a million miles away from the glass and steel cathedral of the Obsidian. But to Leo, it was the only church that mattered. He fumbled with the keys. His hands were still shaking, just a little, from the adrenaline of the night before. The lock was sticky. Grandma always said you had to jiggle it to the left, like you were whispering a secret to it. And when the tumbler finally clicked, the sound echoed in the empty street. Leo pushed the door open. The air inside was stale. It smelled of cold ash and abandonment. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, cutting through the grime on the windows. The chairs were overturned on the tables, legs pointing up like dead beetles. The kitchen, visible through the pass-through window, was dark and silent. For a moment, the weight of it all crushed him. He was 11 years old. He had no money, a broken skillet in his backpack, and a restaurant that hadn't served a meal in 2 weeks. The victory at the Obsidian felt like a dream, fading fast in the harsh light of reality. "I don't know how to run a business, Grandma," he whispered to the empty room. "I only know how to rub the meat." "Good thing you're not alone, then." Leo spun around. Marco was standing on the sidewalk. He wasn't wearing his chef's whites anymore. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, carrying a crate of fresh produce on his shoulder. Behind him, a yellow cab was pulling away. "You actually came?" Leo said, his voice small. "I told you," Marco said, stepping inside and setting the crate on the nearest table. "I like BBQ. He wasn't the only one." Within 20 minutes, the sidewalk in front of Rose's smokehouse looked like a shift change at a union hall. Tony, the sous chef who looked like a linebacker, arrived carrying a set of knives that cost more than Leo's entire wardrobe. Sarah, the pastry chef, walked in with 50 pounds of flour and a determination that was terrifying to behold. Even the dishwasher from the Obsidian, a quiet man named Luis, showed up with a bucket of industrial degreaser he had borrowed on his way out. They didn't ask for instructions. They were professionals. They looked at the chaos of the smokehouse and saw only work to be done. "Tony, check the pit," Marco ordered, assuming the role of head chef naturally. "If the flue is clogged, we're dead in the water." "Sarah, scrub the counters." "Luis, I want these floors to look like mirrors." "Leo?" Leo straightened up. "Yeah?" Marco pointed to the back door. "Go light the fire. We have 6 hours until noon." The next few hours were a blur of controlled violence. The kitchen, which had been silent and cold, roared back to life. The sound of scrubbing brushes on wood, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of knives hitting cutting boards, and the hiss of water hitting hot metal filled the space. It wasn't the sterile, fearful silence of Vance's kitchen. It was noisy, messy, and joyful. Leo stood at the pit, a massive brick cavern in the back of the shop that had been seasoned by 50 years of oak and hickory. He arranged the wood the way Rose had taught him, a pyramid for airflow, damp chips at the base for the slow burn. He struck the match. The flame caught. Thin ribbons of blue smoke began to curl upward, pulled into the draft. That smoke didn't stay inside. It traveled. It drifted out of the chimney, heavy and fragrant, carrying the scent of cumin, brown sugar, and burning oak. It moved down the block, sliding past the laundromat, the bodega, and the subway station. It was a signal, an ancient, primitive notification that said, "We are here. The fire is lit." Inside, Tony was prepping the pork shoulders Leo had salvaged from the freezer. "This dry rub," Tony said, tasting a pinch of the reddish powder. "It's simple. Paprika, salt, pepper, garlic powder, cumin. And what else? There's a kick." "Cayenne," Leo said, not looking up from the fire. "But Grandma toasted it first." Tony laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "Toasted it. Old school. I love it." At 11:45 a.m., a black town car pulled up to the curb. Arthur Sterling stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a cashmere sweater and dark slacks, looking noticeably less armored than usual. He walked to the door, where Sarah was wiping down the last of the window glass. "Are we open?" Sterling asked. Leo wiped his soot-stained hands on his apron and walked to the front. He looked at the clock. It was noon. "We're open," Leo said. He reached for the closed sign, ripped off the yellowed tape, and flipped it over to open. When he turned back to the window, he froze. He hadn't looked outside in hours. He had been too busy watching the fire. But the smoke had done its work. There was a line. It stretched from the front door, past the window, past the laundromat next door, and wrapped around the corner. There were construction workers in neon vests. There were nurses in scrubs coming off the night shift. There were guys in suits who looked like they worked on Wall Street, standing next to grandmothers with shopping carts. They weren't there for a foam or a gel or a deconstructed plate. They were there because they remembered. They remembered the smell. They remembered Rose, and they had heard the story of the boy who took down a giant with a cast-iron pan. Leo felt a hand on his shoulder. Marco stood beside him, looking out at the crowd. "Ready for the rush, chef?" Marco asked. Leo looked at the broken iron skillet, which he had hung on the wall above the register, a fractured monument to the battle they had won. Then he looked at the line of hungry people waiting for a taste of the truth. He smiled, and for the first time since his grandmother died, the smile reached his eyes. "Order up," Leo said. "Let's feed them." The seasons changed in New York, the way they always did, abruptly and without mercy. Winter's gray slush gave way to the humid, golden, heavy heat of July. But the heat inside the obsidian was gone. The glass doors of the famous Midtown restaurant were papered over. A sign taped haphazardly to the inside of the window read simply, "Asset liquidation, auction, Tuesday." Inside, men in coveralls were hauling out the induction burners and the liquid nitrogen tanks. They moved with the indifference of vultures picking a carcass clean. Gordon Vance wasn't there to watch it. He had retreated to a condo in the Hamptons, followed by lawsuits and the crushing silence of a phone that no longer rang. His reputation hadn't just been tarnished, it had been erased, scrubbed away like a stain on a countertop. He had tried to sell a flavor he didn't own, and in the end, the market had decided that a stolen taste leaves nothing but a bitter memory. 10 miles away, in Queens, the heat was different. It was alive. The air conditioning at Rose's Smokehouse was trying its best, but it was losing the war against the 3-ton brick pit and the body heat of 50 people crammed into a space meant for 30. The noise was deafening, a chaotic, beautiful roar of clattering plates, shouting order numbers, and laughter. It was the sound of a community feeding itself. Leo stood at the chopping block. He had grown in the last 6 months. The apron no longer dragged on the floor, and his hands, though still young, moved with a new, practiced confidence. He didn't look like a scared kid anymore. He looked like a pitmaster. "Order 42. Leo called out, his voice cutting through the din. "Pulled pork, double slaw, extra bark." A construction worker wiped sweat from his forehead and grabbed the tray, nodding his thanks. "Keep it coming, Leo." Best damn lunch in the city. Behind Leo, the line moved with the precision of a Swiss watch, or perhaps a very well-oiled machine gun. Marco was on the sides, spooning mac and cheese that was rapidly becoming legendary in its own right. Tony handled the ribs, his tattoos glistening in the heat. Sarah, the former pastry chef of a 3-star restaurant, was now baking cornbread, and she looked happier covered in cornmeal than she ever had dusting gold leaf onto chocolate. They weren't working for a paycheck anymore. They were owners. Leo had split the equity the first week. Grandma didn't believe in employees, he had told them. She believed in family. At the corner table, the one reserved by an unspoken rule for a specific guest, Arthur Sterling sat with a notebook. He wasn't writing a review. He had retired from criticism the day the Obsidian closed. He said he had tasted enough lies for one lifetime. Now, he was writing a cookbook, a history of American barbecue. Leo walked over during a lull in the rush, carrying 2 glass bottles of orange soda. He sat down opposite Sterling. The Edam texture on the brisket is better today, Sterling noted, taking a sip of the soda. You switched the wood, didn't you? More oak, less hickory? Leo smiled. You can't hide anything from you, Arthur. And you, Sterling gestured to the room, can't hide from them. He pointed to the line that still stretched out the door. They come for the food, Leo, but they stay for the story. Leo looked up at the wall above the cash register. There, mounted on a piece of reclaimed wood, hung the cast-iron skillet. It was broken, the crack running jagged down its center, welded together not to be used, but to be remembered. It was black, ugly, and beautiful. It was the only decoration in the shop. I used to think the magic was in the skillet, Leo said quietly, or in the nutmeg, or in the specific way Grandma rubbed the meat. It wasn't? Sterling asked. Leo shook his head. He looked at Marco laughing with a customer. He looked at Tony sneaking a piece of burnt end to a toddler. He looked at the diverse crowd, black, white, brown, rich, poor, sitting elbow to elbow at the communal tables, sharing napkins and stories. Vance had the recipe, Leo said. He had the exact measurements. He even had the nutmeg eventually. But he still failed. Do you know why? Sterling waited. Because he was cooking to show everyone how great he was, Leo said. Grandma cooked to show everyone how much she loved them. He looked at his hands, hands that were stained with smoke and work, hands that had held a dying woman's promise and a billionaire's defeat. You can steal a recipe, Leo said, his voice steady. You can steal a technique. You can even steal a name. But you can't steal the reason why we cook. That's the fire. And fire doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to whoever is willing to get burned to keep it going. The bell above the door jingled. A new group of customers walked in, shaking off the summer rain that had just started to fall. They looked tired. They looked hungry. They smelled the smoke, that ancient, comforting scent of wood and meat, and their shoulders dropped an inch. They were home. Leo stood up. He tightened his apron strings. Back to work, he said. Back to work, chef, Sterling replied with a nod of respect. Leo walked back to the pit, picked up his knife, and turned to the waiting line. The skillet on the wall watched over him, a broken iron heart that had beaten the odds, reminding everyone in the room that the finest things in life aren't perfect. They are real, and that was a taste no money could buy. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but as Leo proved, justice tastes much better when it's smoked low and slow over hickory wood. Now, I want to hear from you. We've all known a Gordon Vance, someone who thinks price tags equal value. But we also know that the best meals of our lives weren't served on fine china. They were served at a kitchen table by someone who loved us. So, tell me in the comments, what is that one meal for you? What is the one family recipe or childhood memory that you would defend with a cast iron skillet? I read your stories, and I'd love to know what home tastes like to you. If you believe that the truth deserves to be heard, and that the underdog should always have their day, make sure you press that subscribe button. We are building a library of stories here. Stories about justice, resilience, and the things that really matter. The kitchen is closed for tonight. But trust me, the next story I have for you is even more incredible. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep your fire lit.